This is Michelle, and you're listening to Words with Michelle, the podcast, a show where I sit down and have conversations with influencers on a range of topics, anything from natural hair, employment, discrimination, food, relationships, and everything in between. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. If you want to send me an email, hit me up at michelle@wordsmichelle.com. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Words with Michelle, the podcast. Today we'll be speaking about mental health awareness in the workplace. I'm really happy that we're speaking about this, not only because I previously worked primarily with clients with mental health issues, but because we are still at a time where people feel fearful of speaking about their mental health. There's definitely more attention and awareness given to it now, but a lot of people have questions and concerns about disclosing their mental health diagnosis at work. I will speak with Wahida Eccles-Smith, an employment lawyer, who will answer your questions regarding disclosure. My next guest is Florence Kasuga, who will speak about her experience working and dealing with mental illness. A quick bio. Wahida Eccles-Smith is a partner at Pax Smith Employment Lawyers, where she handles all employment matters, including disability in the workplace and human rights issues. My second guest is Florence Kasuga, who has branded herself as Chief Happiness Officer. She believes that there's enough negativity in the world, so if there's something she can do to make it brighter, she will. She comes from an extensive career path in retail, and now is currently in operations as an administrator. Mental illness has been a part of her life since her teens. She struggled with situational depression at 17, and then diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in her later 20s. One goal of Florence's is that when she has her own company, she wants to make sure that her job force is comprised of people with mental illness. To start off the episode, I asked my guests to define mental health and mental illness. This is what they had to say.
My thought would be, and it's not a definition, but my thought would be that mental illness is obviously a part of mental health. So mental health, just like health is, it's the status of no matter whether you're well or unwell, it's part of health. But illness is automatically that there's a state of unwellness. So I think that's the default. When people say mental health, it's like it's how to maintain your mental health, how to prevent your mental health from deteriorating. When you speak mental illness, you're already in a negative space.
Connotation.
Okay.
When you think of it too, mental illness would be something to get over in the sense of to work over. Whereas your mental health is kind of your state, your wellness level.
Yeah. So why is mental health awareness in the workplace so important?
So I know, coming from somebody with lived experience, mental health is so important in the workplace just because you're working with so many different personalities, and all of those personalities come from different walks of life. And so mental illness, mental health is just to understand where everybody is coming from and to work with those personalities. So that's why I think it's so important. Just have a sort of like an atmosphere of inclusivity, acceptance, accommodation as well.
From a legal point of view, it's important because if there's a lack of mental health awareness, it can affect the productivity at a workplace. So, for example, and it can cost the company money. So,
Exactly.
To get them awareness itself, though, to get to awareness itself, it also costs money because you should have proper training for your human resources professionals. Lay people don't necessarily understand it. So there's sensitivity training, there's legal training on how to recognize certain things. I know the Human Resources Professional Association puts on seminars for their professionals that are held by lawyers and or spoken to by lawyers in order to get that training, because there's that intersection between how you manage the business, but also to make sure you're compliant with the mental health status under, for example, the Human Rights Code. So awareness is needed for both to get the productivity of the company continuing, but also to make sure the company is protected and the employees protected when any sort of situation arises.
So is it mandatory that there is a mental health awareness in businesses?
It's not mandatory, but you can't discriminate on the basis of mental health. If, for example, it's a disability under the Human Rights Code. Disability is defined quite broadly, so it can be mental or physical. So you can't be discriminated on the basis of a disability. So awareness comes hand in hand with the duty to inquire. So we've all heard about the duty to accommodate when it comes to disability, but it's the duty to inquire that comes first. So an employer, if they sense anything, they're obligated to find out more, but not to the point of prying where give me a diagnosis. That's not allowed. But they're in order to be aware and help the business going and help the employee, they have an obligation to inquire about any disability.
I never knew that. But I know too, even just through past experiences with interviews, I know one of the questions at the end would be, do you have any need for any accommodations, just because they're all part of the AODA Act?
Correct.
Yeah.
So, okay, that goes into a huge question about disclosure. I dealt with clients that, like I said before, that had mental and physical disability. And that was one of the questions I would ask them, like helping them look for work. Did you want to disclose? Is there a big move towards disclosing, or do you feel like most people don't want to disclose?
I know for myself, probably there would be a hang up of not disclosing, just because you don't want to rule yourself out of, say, the interview process. However, there's a catch-22 in the sense of you maybe want to disclose because it would explain why you're acting a certain way, or maybe you're not answering the questions as well as you could have. I know for myself, I've never fully disclosed in an interview process for myself. However, because of course you build those relationships with your coworkers, there would be times where they would note some things that you're feeling off on, or maybe something's preoccupied in your mind. And then just with conversation, I know I would disclose to my coworkers, who ended up being friends. And so honestly, it gave a better perspective on them, on me, because they knew another facet of my life. And so I was working as a guest services representative at one of my jobs. And there was one point where I did disclose to my manager at the time, and he was totally understanding of it. And so I was glad that I did it, because then it kind of like leveled the playing field, if you want to say, because he knew where I was coming from. And there was something that I didn't want to do at the workplace, but he was totally accommodating, totally willing to just understand my point of view. And then eventually we eased myself into doing this new task, and then I kind of rocked it. So I was happy that I did that and disclosed to him. And then it's funny too, because on the flip side of that, there would be other people that I would disclose my diagnosis to. So I have schizoaffective disorder, and they would say to me, well, Florence, you can't have that. And I go, what do you mean you can't have that? So what defines a person who has a certain illness, right? So you get into that perspective and that conversation as well.
Okay, so if you didn't need this accommodation, do you really need to disclose? Like, is that something, I guess, Wahida, if you'd be able to answer that, like, do you think, because I've dealt with clients like that, they didn't really need accommodation. So if they don't necessarily need accommodation in the workplace, do they need to disclose? I mean, legally, should they disclose, or is it just a personal decision?
You're not obligated to disclose. Now, granted, like what Florence was saying earlier, is that sometimes if there's, for example, an evaluation situation, right? So you don't need an accommodation, but you may have certain issues that maybe affect your interactions with coworkers. And you get a performance review and says that, Joe is like this all the time, but Joe didn't need accommodation, but Joe's mental illness may have played a part in how Joe behaves during his interactions with his coworkers, and that ends up on his performance review. So he may want to disclose at that point, but preemptively, there's no obligation, because you don't necessarily know how it's going to affect you in a new environment and new. So just walking in, there's no obligation to walk in and say, this is who I am. Because if you're not looking for accommodation, then no, you don't need, you're not obligated. Having said that, if something happens that affects you and you know there's a reason for it, then disclosing it at that point as an explanation or a mitigating factor. So say you haven't disclosed and you're about to be let go for something.
Mm-hmm.
You should disclose it at that point, just as mitigating factor to maybe try to keep your job, in the sense that the employer didn't know what was happening, you didn't tell them. But if they're about to let you go for something that could be connected to your mental health issues, then disclosing it at that point, it's again a personal decision, but you could disclose it at that point and let them know that perhaps the reason why this has happened is because of my mental health concerns. But in terms of disclosure, and I think you might ask about this, but in terms of disclosure, you certainly can't be let go or should not be let go for disclosing. And so, and employers should be trained enough to know not to do that. And unfortunately, though, employers do end up letting people go for a number of reasons. They just don't tie it to mental health. They can have they can give another reason for termination without cause. They're not linking it to your mental health, so you may never know that that's why you've been terminated from your employment. So unfortunately, the stigma still exists, as Florence can probably attest to that.
Mm-hmm. So I'll actually give a personal experience. So in the early parts of my diagnosis, so I was diagnosed probably about 2006, 7, 8, around those times. So nonetheless, I had been working at the mall at a retail store, and a gentleman walked by, and that's the gentleman that I knew from the hospital. And so I was obviously caught off guard. And then we just had, just the, normal chit chat. And then he had left. And I remember feeling during my whole shift, oh my goodness, maybe the employer knew that we were connected somehow from the hospital, and they knew about the psychiatric ward, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, the next day, I was not working anymore. And so I thought the timing was very off. But then again, maybe I just wasn't performing at my role. So that could be it as well. But that was triggering things in my head, and then therefore adding to my mental health issues and everything like that. But yeah, that was just one experience that I had way back in the day. And unfortunately, I wasn't armed with information. So it's not like I used my voice to talk back to the employer to say what was really the reason. I actually just took it in and then left for the day. So yeah, it was.
So you never questioned,
I did not question. Yeah, I was very, very in my younger days. And then, like I said, didn't use my voice as well as I could have to find out exactly what had happened. But yeah, during that time, during the early parts of my diagnosis, that was a very interesting time in my life. And that was just one experience that still stands out to my day. Yeah.
So I can tell you, Florence, if that had happened today, and even if you had asked, only the most foolish employer would admit to, well, we're letting you go because of a disability of any kind. Instantly, they are opening themselves up to a lawsuit, a human rights application for discrimination on the basis of disability. So that's why we're not naive enough to believe that employers haven't let people go for conditions. It's just they don't make the overt link for them, because they would set themselves up for an application before the tribunal.
So that kind of ties into my next question. When I was dealing with clients and they would miss work because they were not feeling well, can someone be fired for missing work due to mental health issues?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and this goes back to the duty to inquire. Did the employer know or suspect that there may be something going on? Because part of the issue with mental health is that when you're in the throes of some sort of situation, the ability to speak about it with your employer, to ask for an accommodation outright may not necessarily be there. So this is where the employer would need to discreetly inquire into the absenteeism to see if there is a need to accommodate. So the person themselves may not volunteer a request for accommodation. It would be the employer who should look into that and inquire, and then offer accommodation. So once they're aware of it, they do have a duty to accommodate. But if they're missing work, and they're being, again, let go for missing work, they have to make that link as to why they're missing work.
Okay.
Right? Because chronic absenteeism, if the employer believes that they're just don't care about their job and they come and go as they please, then obviously most employers have an absenteeism policy and a workplace attendance policy. So it's the reasoning behind why they're absent and why they're letting them go for being absent.
Just from personal experience, luckily, so I come from a retail background of 20 plus years, and those roles have more or less been part-time roles. And so for myself, I've been able to have those appointments on my off days or leave, and it didn't conflict with my work. So now I'm actually in an office environment. I'm in the non-for-profit sector now, but luckily, and not good, I've always had great employers that have been understanding. So right now in this, in my role right now, in the non-for-profit sector, my boss is totally understanding that I do have to excuse myself when an appointment comes up. She's totally on board, and so it helps so much when you have that management team behind you that supports you.
So that's because you fully disclose, right? So that's why they were able to accommodate you?
Yeah.
Okay. So then I guess it's more so for the clients or for people that haven't disclosed, there may be a little bit of issue. And I guess, Wahida, you were saying that it makes it a little easier, possibly, if they do disclose.
It makes it easier, but also there's, if for example they don't disclose and they are let go for chronic absenteeism, there can be an argument made that the pattern should have been noted by the employer that this is something unusual for this person and that they should have inquired. So that's the key, is that it depends on how long the person's been there. If the employer is, it's a very fact-specific case, fact-specific situation. So in this particular case, for example, Florence, your employers know, but if they didn't and all of a sudden you started missing days, asking beyond like, why are you not here? It's not enough. Is there anything we can help you with?
I see.
To ask whether there is a way the employer can help. Because here's the other thing is, if the person's missing work, because self-diagnosis is a problem, right? You can't, if you're taking mental health days and self-diagnosing and taking the days away, that's fine, but your employer doesn't necessarily know what's going on behind the scenes. So in order to protect yourself from that, and let them know, disclosing makes sense at that point. Because here's the thing is that if you've been, let's say you've been chronically absent for days and weeks and it's getting to the point where you need short-term disability leave, well, you can't avail yourself of those programs easily if you haven't disclosed, right? Because there's short-term disability programs, there's long-term disability programs, and also if there's a disability management program that's in place at your company, if the company is big enough, you can help to come back to work after a period of absence if you've disclosed it and are using up that plan that's in place. But you can't really avail yourself of any of that if you haven't disclosed, right?
Yeah, that's
so.
That answer is beautiful. That will help so many different people, because I know, just because of what I used to do, like dealing with my clients, there was this huge fear. Like disclosure was like always off the table. I will say with 100% of my clients, like literally no one ever disclosed. I'm not gonna lie. Like it was just, they felt they didn't need accommodation. But now in retrospect, listening to what you just said, when they went back to work, there was always an issue. So disclosure may have been a good idea. Mind you, it is personal and they were able to make that own decision. But thinking about what you just said, I mean, a lot of clients missed work because they weren't feeling well, which is understandable. Do you know what I mean? So, disclose.
It also offers a layer of protection, right? Because if you've disclosed to your employer that you're suffering from a mental health disability or a physical, then they're a little more careful with you in terms of when, like, let's say they're planning on letting you go for something, but you've told them what's going on. They would probably not want to let you go at that point, because then the timing matters. It's like you've just leave,
right,
and you're like, oh, they would be setting themselves up. So it's not that you're trying to like game the system or anything like that. It's just it makes them understand what happened, and it would make them think twice about possibly terminating the employment at that time if you've just come back from leave, because you've let them know what's going on.
Yeah.
right.
Actually, another question that I got from some of my audience was, what happens when they disclose? Like, actually, what you did, Florence, you disclosed to not only management, but to coworkers, and then they are now bullied in the workplace. What can they do?
Well, it depends on the size of the business, because some businesses have human resources departments. Others are just mom and pop shop with small, with nobody else there. They should document it. If they're feeling bullied, they should document it for either themselves or if they have human resources department, write to human resources and say, this is what's happening. Keep track of, keep a log of events, words, how people are behaving. Like, for example, if they're even being excluded from things that were previously included in, for example, like the isolation at a workplace, it runs the gamut. So if they're feeling harassed, bullying, actually, the term bullying doesn't actually appear in the Human Rights Code. It has to be, that deals more with the Occupational Health and Safety Act, where the employer is obligated to have an environment that's free from discrimination. But basically, the person should log it and report it. And they shouldn't be punished for that reporting, because if they're punished as a rabble rouser or whatever, then that can fall into the heading of reprisal. Because if you complain and you're punished for the complaint, that you can argue that you were they acted in reprisal for you basically complaining about an issue. Log it, record it, and if you're too afraid to let them know, at the very least, record it for yourself. But it's easier said than done. I understand that.
So then, you may have answered this, Wahida, but how do we create an inclusive environment?
Well, I think it's again, that's tough, because the environments themselves can be different, right? So certain workplaces are less prone to it, and certain workplaces are more prone to having this kind of lack of understanding about mental health. For example, traditional jobs, like let's say at a factory, or labor-intensive jobs, where they're primarily male gender, might not be as open to discussing mental health. Or certain professions, I can tell you, the legal profession, you don't, despite all the efforts that are being made about mental health, there's a handful of people I can tell you that have actually spoken about their mental health issues, and they tend to be after they've arrived. So, for example, one of the proponents of mental health for Ontario lawyers was a partner at one of the biggest law firms, and that's when he finally disclosed. Wow. Not when he was an up-and-coming student, articling student, or first year. So it's inclusivity comes from once you reveal it, to first make it easy to reveal, and then when people are revealed, to not punish them for that revealing, because it's not a situation of, oh, you can just get over it, right? Like I saw an illustration where mental health is like, you can't tell somebody with mental health to get over it, because it's basically like asking a deaf person to listen better.
I think another point too to add is inclusivity in the sense of even workshops. So if the organization has bandwidth to say bring in a facilitator to talk about mental health in the workplace, or different things like that, that shows that the employer is making that effort to learn more about this topic.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes hand in hand with the fact that organizations of a certain size have to have a workplace anti-discrimination policy. And that's not just for racism, gender, that's discrimination on the basis of disability. So awareness, and not just once a year.
Right, exactly. Even it's pretty cool too. Even I think it's, I don't know if it's St. John's or something or another, but they're actually doing mental health first aid training. And so I thought that was pretty awesome.
Oh, that's terrific. I did not know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did that. It was kind of, I'm not sure if it was mandatory, but we did that for one of the jobs that I was at. It was like a 2-day thing, and
I want to do it.
Yeah, it was pretty good. I mean, because it gave me insight how to deal with my clients, right?
For sure.
And even before I worked at this last position, I worked at another organization, and I only had one client disclose a disability. So it made me understand how to talk to my clients more. I mean, I still need lots more training. I mean, not just a little bit, but it made me understand like reactions and how they relate to me. So I did enjoy the training. I totally did.
It all comes back to just making and having the talk. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just introducing that this is such a big topic in our lives.
Yeah.
And so just starting with something, just start with something and don't do nothing.
And the people in organizations that have like human resources departments, they should be trained in how to address it. It's not just a legal point of view. It's a workplace productivity. It's a morale. If it's handled properly, it helps the job site. It helps the company at the end of the day as well. So it's worth the investment.
Right.
As we neared the end of the program, I asked Wahida and Florence just to provide me with a few closing comments.
In terms of closing comments, one of the things I was thinking of is that like we've come a long way, but we have such a long way to go.
Exactly.
Like recently, I started to think about how long it took for first responders to get help after like this PTSD that they were suffering from.
Yeah.
Like you would think that this should have been part of their post incident debrief, is that how did that affect you? But it took a drunk driver killing a family and the first responders wanting to essentially strike almost before they're like, hey, our paramedics who show up in these incidents, they're affected deeply. Maybe they should get some mental health help after these incidents.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a very visible, obvious segment of the population who sees the worst things all the time.
Okay. Vicarious trauma is real. Vicarious trauma is real. And that's quickly, because I got 2 more minutes, but that's quickly like because I definitely feel that I went through that. Like when you're dealing with people that are going through some sort of trauma, you feel it too. You're affected by that, like completely. Okay, so I just have like a few more minutes. Florence, if you had anything to say in like less than a minute, would be awesome.
Right. I know for myself, just you are not your illness, in the sense of there is more to you than just a label. Do you know what I mean? And so luckily, I've had a smooth road to recovery. I mean, I have great friends, great support system, great family, but not everybody has that. And so if we could just be a little more caring, a little more thoughtful to that person beside us, because everybody's battling something, and just start that conversation and then just talk it out. I'm a big believer in talk therapy.
I truly want to thank both guests, Wahida and Florence, for their expertise, knowledge, and honest answers. They've definitely provided me with information, and I hope they've helped you. To listen and subscribe to the podcast, again, go to iTunes or Spotify, or you can listen to it on my blog, Words with Michelle. That's www.wordswithmichelle.com. Want to send me a comment or want to be on the show, send me an email, michelle@wordswithmichelle.com. Until next time, bye.